Hello everybody, welcome to another video of mine. I'm going to be showing a game which I just played in the Four Nations Chess League, obviously online, seeing as over-the-board chess has not yet returned to Great Britain or most of Europe. This game is one where we have 45 minutes for the entire match with a 15-second increment throughout the game. And this is played on board 1 for my team in Division 2. So I'm not playing the very strongest players who are in Division 1, Grandmasters and International Masters, but I believe there are quite a lot of 2200 level players. And my opponent here is his English rating is the equivalent of about 2100. So solid player. He starts off with c4, I play knight f6, g3, and e5. So we're going into a kind of reversed Sicilian. After bishop g2, I can play the line of playing pawn d5, then after captures and my knight will recapture, the main line variation is to go knight to c3. And because white is a tempo up from playing a dragon Sicilian, this changes the nature of the game significantly. I can't really hold this knight forever on d5, so the main line move these days is to bring it back to b6. White attacks the pawn, black defends the pawn, and I believe d3 is a move, but I think castling is more common. Black will play bishop e7. Some of these moves are perhaps not quite in the right order, but this is the type of position you usually get. Then usually a3 is played at some stage, trying to go b4. Black can allow b4, they can also play pawn a5. The line that I've seen most commonly is castles, then either knight d2 or b4. I think knight d2 is slightly preferable, but I might be wrong here. And black's playing f6 and then b4. And we're then into the kind of mainline theory in this opening. So essentially we're in a reverse Sicilian where black has not really had time to castle on the queen side as you would do in a Sicilian dragon. That's because of white having the extra tempo and being able to effectively attack you on the queen side. So you have to settle for castling kingside, where the game will be usually settled in the centre and queenside. And white can do a kind of double fianchetto, which black can't often affect in the Sicilian dragon lines. So essentially it's about equal in these positions, but I think some experts believe white is a very small amount better because they can bring their d2 knight to c5 in the future to attack the e6 bishop and the b7 pawn. Anyway, I don't choose to play this line, so after bishop g2 I play bishop c5. This is a very kind of bread and butter style way of playing. All I'm doing really is to castle quickly on the king side, then play things like rook e8, and later on try to push d5, where I'll have enough pieces in the centre that I will have essentially equalised. Knight c3 is chosen. It's a very flexible move. I personally play knight c3 before I play g3 bishop g2, because it's so universal that there are very few lines where the bishop does not actually fianchetto, and you can play an early e3 with something like bishop e2 or d4. But you always go knight c3. I castle, and e3 is chosen. So white is electing to kind of display what their setup is. They're very unlikely to play knight f3 in the coming moves. The setup is normally, if I were to play kind of very passively, I say passively, kind of without intruding on white's plans, kind of letting white do whatever they want. The setup's usually knight g to e2, and let's go d6. White will castle on the king side, as is usual in the English opening, and then try to either play a quick d4 to open up the diagonal for their bishop. So if d4 and I capture the pawn, they can take with the knight. It's certainly a valid move, but taking with the pawn is also an effective kind of move to play, and then get their bishop onto this diagonal to go to either f4, e3, or g5, where white's got all their minor pieces well placed. And the other idea that white can do is not to play d4 straight away, but first to either go b3 or a3. And the essential idea, let's say a3 is chosen, I'll play a5 to stop my bishop getting stuck. And white will fianchetto on the queen side. And again, let's give myself some moves that don't really affect white's plan. And then d4 again can be done. And what could happen is if I take on d4, they can take with their knight. And if I retreat the bishop somewhere, white's got lots of options. Knight b5, pawn d5, pawn takes. Sort of more quiet moves like queen d2 is a possibility here. Rook c1. And white's queenside play is quite good here because they've gained a bit of space on the queen side. Black is essentially playing in the centre and somewhat controlling the king side with their bishops and knights, but also they do have some influence on the queen side. But I generally think that white is better because of the double fianchetto. So that's white's plan with e3. I play rook e8. This move is designed for two reasons. Reason number one is it prevents d4 from being played. If white plays d4, I take it. White cannot take back because my rook is lined up with their king. And the other reason I play this is that I'm vacating the f8 square, so I can, if I need to, put my bishop back on f8 and then fianchetto. So it's a flexible move, but it also helps me control the centre of the board. Now, I think a really key error from my opponent was d3. This is a sort of quiet setup, designed to play things like knight g to e2, queen c2, maybe a fianchetto in the future, and castling. The thing is that d3 is not necessary. White can play d4 in one move. The only thing d3 would be good for, really, is to play e4 later in the game and do a Botvinnik system with knight g e2, and then white tries to clamp down on the dark squares. But the thing is that if you're playing e3 to e4, why not play e2 to e4 in one move, and not move the e-pawn twice? So d3 to me doesn't look correct. I think knight g e2 is a lot better, with the advantage for white being that they can castle very fast. My guess is that my opponent did not want to allow me the move e4, which I have no intention of playing, to be honest. E4 does have some good things about it, in that it will sort of clamp down on some light squares and make white's sort of life a little difficult. But the thing is that white can always break with moves like pawn f3. They could attack me again with queen c2. Their dark square control is now very effective. They can go a3, b4, forcing my bishop back to f8. And this is just it's a pawn move. It's not really helping me to gain some space. If I could play the move c6 and d5, maybe I have a pawn chain that's strong enough to withstand white's kind of counterattack. But I don't think e4 is useful right now. And worst case scenario, white can play d4 straight away, and I'll probably have to take en passant. Then white can take with the queen, and their development is greater than my own. So d3 was chosen, maybe for that reason. I played c6 now. I want to quickly go d5, gain control of the centre of the board. Queen b3. This move, I think, is designed against d5. I can't see any other reason for you to move the queen in this way. So I can't go d5 just yet, although I felt like it was the move I had to play very soon, because I need to release my c8 bishop and my queen in order to kind of gain advantage or even just equality. So first I play knight to a6. My thinking is that if I can't play d5 next move, I can play things like knight c7 or knight b4, which will then control d5 enough for me to play it. My opponent now goes knight ge2, and I then start, I think, for quite a long time here. I think I thought for around 10 minutes on this move. What I'm always thinking of, firstly and most importantly, is how to improve my position, how to improve pieces for the most part, but also what is my plan. And I thought that I kind of had two interlocking plans. Number one is their king. As long as their king remains in the center, it is weak. If I can keep the king in the center or attack with initiative, then I think I definitely have, at the very least, equality, but maybe a better position. And the secondary part of this plan is that their pieces are not that well coordinated, and their queen is perhaps a little bit vulnerable in the future. Maybe I can play bishop e6 or knight c5. So thinking about all that, I thought that I wanted to open up the game quickly before their castle, and the move I've been trying to play is d5. So all that to me signposted that I should be playing d5 very soon. And after spending a long time analysing this position, I ended up playing d5 anyway, despite the fact I am not covering d5 enough. White does take the pawn. I recapture, strengthening my centre, and white takes the bait. They grab the free material in the centre, and I need to keep on sort of deflecting their pieces and making it difficult for them. Now, they could take with their queen, which I was hoping for, because now I would take their queen, and they would pretty much have to take back. Then knight b4 is, I think, a move which gives me the advantage. White cannot defend the bishop, defend d3, and prevent knight to c2 check, winning their rook with a fork. So I believe their best move would be bishop b3, upon which I can put them in check. Their king will now have to march to f1 for them to avoid losing the f2 pawn. Then I can play bishop h3 check, forcing the king to g1, where their rook on h1 is essentially a bystander in this game. And I don't think I have quite enough to mate them, but I have the amusing idea of knight to e1 threatening knight f3 mate. And it's not pleasant at all for white to defend this. So knight e1 might even be the best move. I hadn't analysed quite this far in the real game. Rook a d8 probably also very strong. And knight takes bishop might be a long-term advantage of the bishop pair. But this move's just amusing, and it's not that easy for white to stop this. So queen takes d5 is not very good. So bishop takes d5 is what they played, which I expected. And I had analysed the move bishop to b4 check. This was roughly where my analysis was ending, because I'd had to analyse about 4 or 5 moves ahead. And I normally say I can only analyse 3 moves ahead, but what you have to remember is that several of those moves were just captures and recaptures, which are fairly easy to analyse, even for players who are rated, say, below 1600. They can analyse, several captures in a row and work out what piece will be the last one standing. So really, I've only analysed the moves d5, a bunch of captures, and then bishop check. Now, here's the thing. Almost no matter what they do, I will play knight c5 next turn. Except for the move they did in the game, of course. If king to this square on d1, knight c5 is very, very strong. The thing is that their queen is essentially tied down to the bishop on d5. And if they ever take the pawn on f7 and check me, I sidestep. And again, their queen does not have many places to go. If queen takes the bishop, I have several moves, but one of them would be knight takes d3. Then I've got lots of discovered checks, like knight takes f2, discovered check, knight takes b2, etc. And again, I'm down in material, but I have all my pieces doing something. Even the c8 bishop is ready to jump into g4, pinning the knight, and immediately becoming active. White's pieces are still in disarray, and their king, again, is extremely weak. So I can take advantage of that to win material. And if they go, say, queen to take me on b4, I can immediately take their bishop, and I'm aiming at their rook and at d3. And white is maybe even worse in this position than they would be in the previous one. So king d1 can't work. The more obvious moves are bishop d2 and knight c3, but to both of them I can play knight c5. And the queen cannot take my bishop because of knight takes d3 forking king and queen. If their queen goes to, say, c2, guarding their pawn, I will take their bishop free, also hitting their rook. So queen c4 remains the only move they can do, which defends both the bishop and the pawn and doesn't lose the queen. But then I have the excellent move b5, which this is what I analysed after bishop check. And now their queen has no squares. I don't know what the best move is, possibly giving away the queen, playing something like bishop takes rook, or maybe even queen takes bishop. And it looks like white's position is falling apart. So bishop d2 doesn't work, and knight c3 doesn't work for the same reason. This may be even worse because their queen is now not even guarding d3 straight away. And again, queen c2, I can take the bishop on d5 because their knight's pinned. Queen takes bishop, still loses their queen, and queen c4, I still have b5. So I thought my position was excellent. But they played another move. They played king to f1. And this confused me a bit. It turns out that my best move is actually playing knight c5 again. But I didn't play that because there were somewhat complicated positions arising after things like bishop takes f7 and queen takes bishop, where I'm no longer able to win their queen with knight takes d3. So on reflection, I played bishop h3 check, which turns out to be an error. After the game, I looked, and apparently knight c5 is significantly better than this move. But this is like the second or third best option, so it wasn't awful. And I was expecting king g1, and I missed their move bishop g2, which essentially solves their problem of the bad connection between their pieces and their queen being overloaded. So I then dropped back. I don't want to trade any pieces because I am still a pawn down. Their queen is also, as I said earlier, apart from their king being weak and being kicked around a bit, their queen was also a bit misplaced. So what I'm doing is trying to gain tempo on the queen. It's somewhat vulnerable here. This will force white to make concessions, and perhaps I can build up a head of steam. So queen d1 was played. This is probably the best move. It still needs to be guarding d3, and if queen c2 I could play rook c8, gaining more time on their queen. So now I go knight c5. It's my worst piece, so I improve it. I attack d3, defend b7 from their bishop. Potentially I've got e4 coming. And can you see how white will lose after the move a3? At first this looks very good, because if I drop the bishop to a5, b4 would fork my knight and bishop. But what would I do here? What's black's best move? Well done if you found it. The move is bishop to b3, and their queen is trapped by my two bishops. White will be losing two pieces for a queen at best. I would assume their best move is pawn takes bishop. And then I take their queen, then they take my knight. And I'm still way ahead. So white played d4, which is a move I completely missed. Had to spend a while on this move. The trouble is that if I move my knight anywhere, like d7, white has the option of playing d5 or even pawn takes pawn, and if the queens were traded, and again, if white had their pieces coordinated in a move or two, they would solve all their problems. So most importantly, I need the queens to remain on the board, and I can't allow white gaining tempi, and coordinating their forces together. Their rooks are a long way from being connected, but if they can play things like bishop d2, maybe bishop f3 and king g2, then they've practically solved the problems and remain a pawn up. And pawn takes pawn, they just take with their knight, and again they improve pieces. So the move I did was bishop c4. This keeps their knight pinned. They can't take my knight or pawn because their queen is pinned. And my plan was to then take the pawn next turn. So if they do a move like pawn h4, so that's some irrelevant move. Now I can capture, because if they retake it, maybe with the queen, because they want to trade queens, I could then do bishop takes knight check, and then queen takes queen, and they are pinned. They cannot recapture my queen due to my e8 rook, which has been dutifully standing on e8 for the majority of the game, and it finally realizes its potential to win the match for me. So bishop c4 I think was a good move. It forces white to do something, and they get out the pin with king g1. So they've kind of castled by hand, except for the fact their rook on h1 is entirely useless. If their rook could be transported to f1, I think that would solve so many problems for white that I would suspect that black is actually worse. But because their rook is bad, it gives me time to play rook c8. All my pieces have now moved or have influenced the game. My queen hasn't yet moved, but it's still been a force to be reckoned with. And white still has not yet managed to develop most of their, well, I say most of, a large portion of their forces. I was looking at the move bishop d2, and a bit like the game, what I had planned was actually to trade off a bunch of pieces, like this, take the knight, queen takes, and then have pawn takes pawn, where again their e3 pawn is pinned by my e8 rook. And I think I have the advantage because my pawn is quite advanced, can cause a lot of problems for white. And despite the fact that I have a knight, they have a bishop, which usually the bishop overpowers the knight in these kind of somewhat open games, as it's a long-range piece. The coordination of my forces and the initiative will remain with me, so I think my position is better. But white played b3 instead, which leads to a similar type of position, but one where I keep an extra piece on the board, the dark squared bishops. And my dark squared bishop is way better than theirs in that it's moved, and it's in white's half, causing problems. So white did play bishop d2, and I saw a way to win a pawn. And I think rather hastily, I took this pawn. And what this does is if white takes back with the queen, they'll lose it. If white takes the pawn, their queen is taken by my queen. So they take me. Now, what do you think black's best move is here? If you said pawn takes pawn check, so that you stay a pawn up, that's actually incorrect. It's the move I did because it looked to be the easiest move, but it was a very silly idea. Notice how after pawn takes pawn and king takes, they have now connected their rooks, so that when I take their queen, their rook activates. They've solved a lot of their problems here. Okay, I'm pawn up and technically better, but I just don't really understand why I did this move. It was so silly of me. I just played a bit too quick. I should have played one of my rooks to capture. My guess would be the c8 rook, is because it's on the more open line. Then if white doesn't do anything, I'm going to play pawn e2 and get a monstrous passed pawn. So I think they should take me. And here, I don't want to allow king f2, connecting the rooks. So rook d2, rook on the second rank. And if I turn on the computer, I think this is going to be at least minus 1.5, something like that. It's minus 2 maybe. And that's pretty much what it's giving, about 1.8 or so, 1.9. The computer line is to play rook f1, then I can capture this pawn, still preventing the rooks from being connected. Rook f2 attempting to trade rooks, but I can check. So force their pieces into a horrible contortion here. The king finally is able to get off the first rank, but I am still a pawn up. They're pinned, their bishop can't move, and I can play very simple moves, getting my king active. It's suggesting rook e2, and I think because now I'm a pawn up, I can even play rook takes rook, which will be a win. But rook d2 I'm sure is also very, very strong, because I can win the a2 pawn as well. Go 2 pawns up. So yeah, this is significantly better for black. So the game move I did was not very good. Pawn takes pawn is, I think, inferior to the best line. So they did manage to play rook d1, and I quickly tried to activate the king to get all my pieces working well, doing what they should be doing. Then rook d5, so I think white is trying to double up the rooks, and I do capture so that I can play rook d8, gaining control of the open file. What would you play if white replied with the move rook to d1? What is black's best continuation here? So the move I had seen was, I think, quite nice. Knight to e4 check. If the bishop takes the knight, I take the rook. And I don't think it matters where the king goes. So if king e1, let's say, protecting their rook and preparing to move the bishop, I can now play knight c3 with their rook being attacked and the bishop in a fork. I don't think there's a way to save material, so I'm assuming the best move is bishop f3, where they will only lose the exchange. But at this level, this is fairly straightforward. And to be honest, I would do the Grandmaster technique, or the Dolmatov rule, as I call it. Just sack the exchange straight back, and then simply run forwards with my king. Have it so the kings are as far up as they can be, and then I would start pushing my majority on the king side, and it's a fairly straightforward win. So that was the idea behind this. Rook d8. They played bishop f3 first, allowing me to infiltrate with rook d2, and then I was expecting bishop to e2, where I had a few different plans, but instead they played king e3. So I captured a pawn, now I'm 2 pawns up, and I missed b4. It's a clever move because it attacks b7 indirectly. Their bishop is aiming at b7. My knight, which is the guardian of that square, has to move. So I played knight a4, bishop takes bishop, bishop takes pawn. So in order to remain materially ahead and dominate the position, I played rook b2. Again, I'm trying to keep their rook tied down on a1. I don't want it getting counterplay with rook c1 checking me all over the place. a3, I think, is the only move. Then rook b3 check, forcing the king away from the majority of pawns that they have. I don't want their king coming to, say, c5 or c4, and then being able to push their 2 pawns against my 1 pawn, making a passed pawn, and my life very difficult. So I force the king to run to guard its g-pawn, then play knight c3. My idea is to attack the weak a3 pawn. in the next turn or so. And if the a3 pawn moves, I can take b4. Bishop f3 was chosen by white. This is also to prevent the other plan I had, which if white played something, I don't know, something like bishop c6, just some move that prevents knight b5, I can then play knight to e2 check, and I win the g3 pawn, and I will have 3 connected passes on the king's side, which should be enough to win even if I sacrifice my knight for the 2 pawns on the queen side. So bishop f3 was designed against knight to e2, but it allows knight to b5. And finally, if they played bishop to a6, which is a move which prevents both those moves, well done to black. I think I could play knight b1 or rook b1 even. And if I can't do that, there's always moves like king to e7. Then if I'm checked by the rook, I can then play like king to f6. And I am improving the king. Again, the a3 pawn is very weak, and I don't think there's enough counterplay for white in this position. Now, they played bishop c6. I think this was designed to try and trade off a lot of pawns, and that way they might think they have a draw. So they go b5, thinking that I won't want to trade pawns, which is partly true. You know, in an ideal world, I would want to keep the a and b pawns on to kind of stretch the defences. But there's 2 very key things. Number 1, their bishop against knight scenario. My knight is better in positions where the game is essentially the fighting is taking place on one side of the board. Here, the fighting's mostly on the queen side, but in the future the king side will come into play, so their bishop will be able to influence both. And secondly, after I do knight takes bishop, they will have to trade off the minor pieces in order to win the a7 pawn. There is rook a5, I guess, but I then have annoying moves like knight to d4, and the position gets complicated and they might lose the g-pawn too. So by trading pieces, I now go into an easily winning rook and pawn ending. Rook takes. Without minor pieces, the headache is lessened considerably. I play g6 to give my king a flight square to g7, just in case they try anything. And I also play h6 here. I don't want white playing g5, dominating my pawns, where every pawn move I can do will allow them to trade off. So I play h6 just to keep their pawn in line. Rook c7, they don't really have a move. King g7, increasing the influence of the king. Then rook c6. And to be honest, I really want to have just 2 connected passed pawns against just nothing. So the move h5, it may not be the most accurate move. There might be a way for me to later on just win the g-pawn. This makes things so much easier. If they play g5, I can play rook f5 check, and there is nowhere for the king to go, which defends the pawn. g4 is covered by the h-pawn. So white took me, and then, importantly, do not take with the pawn. Even though it brings my pawn, closer to the end of the board, their king will always be able to catch it, and 2 disconnected pawns like this are very, very hard to win. And in fact, f and h pawns, and to an extent a and c pawns, in this type of position with a rook and pawn ending, there are lots and lots of positions in that setup which are draws, because white essentially is able to prevent the f-pawn queening, and if I try trading the f-pawn off to get the rooks off the board, it will then just simply be a king each and my h-pawn, which is the draw. I believe as long as they're preventing the pawn that's further up the board from moving, it's a draw in these positions. I don't know this ending as well as I should do, but I don't trust myself to win this ending, because it takes very, very precise play. But with rook takes, that makes things very easy. My two pawns can defend each other, they can be pushed up the board together, and white doesn't really have any chance here. So I go rook h4 check, nearly blundering. What would you play as white? So you may be thinking, it doesn't matter what I play because every move loses. And you're correct, every move does lose. But the move that gives you the greatest chance of not losing is king g5, which computers don't see. This is to go off on a side rant, this is where computers start to fall down, because they evaluate the position based on your opponent making the very best moves, which I try to do in all my games. But when it comes to when you're totally lost, you have to try and do a thing called swindling, which is either setting a trap to win the position if they go wrong, or to draw and save the point. So what king g5 does is it sets a trap, and it's not easy to find the trap if you haven't seen this idea before. If white goes rook h5 check, or even like rook h1, then it's fine, black will win this game. But if they go rook to b4, can you see why or how white is able to potentially save the game? The move is rook takes g6 check. Black now has the unenviable task of winning with just an extra pawn, because if they take the rook, it is stalemate, draw. The technical best move would be king to f8, I would guess, and then white could put their rook back. And this is a draw. Again, white needs to know what they're doing, but essentially as long as their king is in front of the pawn, so the white king on the f-file, and their rook is not in a really silly place where it can get skewered or taken or something, white should always be able to draw this. So king g5 is the move I would do, because black has to essentially play rook h5 check, repeating the position, or rook h1, where rook takes g6 will not be a stalemate after pawn takes, and then black can win eventually. So that's what I would do. But king g3 was chosen, which gives me rook to b4, rook c6. Now, for me at least, it's very important, because this is the method I know, I never have the pawns on the same rank as each other. So I don't want them on, say, g5 and h5 and f5, because then the black king can get checked a lot. And the further you push the pawns, the more checks white has. So what I do is I always try and keep the pawns like this, where they're diagonally protecting one another. So I play the move g5. That way I'm not playing f6 to put the pawns on the same rank. I could have played f5, but I didn't want any checks. Then rook over. Now f6, breaking my rule, never play f6. Rook to c6, king g6, keeping my king near the pawns. And white resigned. So let's see what happens if the game continues. Rook c8. Again, if I play f5, they have lots of checks on the 8th rank. So I would do g4. King h4 is a move. And then f5. Now I can get checked a little bit here, so I have to be somewhat careful. And if rook g5, I can then gain a tempo essentially and force the rook back down. And actually white is essentially lost here, because I'm threatening rook to h3 mate, and if I get checked, king g6, check, and I believe king f7, the white rook is going to have to move somewhere away, and I can then win fairly easily, I think, with g3 might be sufficient to win. But I think it is, because after g3, and they probably have to take the pawn, g2, then if rook to a1, rook to h1, and it's a win. But I don't need to play like that, and it's possible that there's a mistake here. Ooh, okay, yeah, rook a7, king e6. Oh, king f4 is a draw. Okay, so there's no reason to do that. So rook f3 is the alternative, which I generally do in a safety move. So what this does is it just protects all the pawns. Nothing can be taken. And the idea is to play g3, f4, rook f2, and just repeat this setup with the pawn guarding the rook guarding the backward pawn, and the other pawn guarding the pawn. And it doesn't matter where the white king or white rook are, they can't stop this setup from working. So if we give the move, instead of king h4, if we give white a bunch of wasteful moves, so for example king g5 is good for black, the idea is to play rook b3 check next turn, forcing the white king back and then to follow up with f5. If white checks, we can give us the king a hiding square on f5. Again, this is the reason you don't have the pawns side by side. And say rook back to a8, check. Again, king h4, rook h3 is mate. So king g2. King f4. They can't check from behind, they check from the side. Then if they check, I just go f5, so they'll come back. f5. And then if they check me from behind, I can always play king to f4, giving my king safety, a shield from all the checks. So they'll keep going back, and again, check, force the king back. Now I could go king g3, which I'm sure is winning, but to follow up the method, g3, and let's say rook a3 is chosen. Again, sidestep, so play f4 coming up. a7, f4. Now, there are a few cunning moves like rook to a8. So here's the sort of final trick to it. If black plays something like king f3, then rook a3 check, and the king comes back again, and we repeat the position to this. If f3 is chosen, here's where all the checks happen. And this is not easy to win. I think it must be winning, because black is still 2 pawns up. But just the sheer amount of checks is going to be extremely annoying. And eventually the black king will probably hide itself on maybe somewhere like d1 or g1, b1 I mean. Block the check, and then after the rook moves, black will be able to continue trying to win the game. But that's taking way too long to win the match. There's quite a nice winning move here after rook a8. The final kind of trick that I've seen before is, well, not trick, but the method to win, is rook b1 check, and then you actually do mate right at the end with pawn f3. So my opponent resigned rather than go through all this sort of torturous rook and pawn ending stuff, because I think he would know that as somebody who's over 2100, I can win this game without too much difficulty. Anyway, that was my game. Unfortunately, the team that I was playing on did not manage to win the match. I won on top board. Our board 2 managed to win as well. And then there were some very close games on board 3 and 4, which ultimately we both lost. So the whole match was tied 2-2. And there's no like tiebreaker or anything, it's just a draw. And in I think 2 weeks is the next Four Nations Chess League online match. So I will do another video, if not fairly soon. I will definitely do one for that. So I'll hopefully do another one in the meantime, but if I don't, I'll see you in 2 weeks. Right, bye.